The first thing I want to do at the point of my speech is explain to you what both sides look like and what this concept means. I think this is going to be very crucial within the day. Firstly, art contains no objective concept, and that is perceived by the majority and the people within the population. That is the kind of world in which we believe want on the outside of the house. Secondly, however, creators, we believe, can create with their own messaging and the will to do so. If you want to create a piece work claiming for the friendship is good, I think that is possible, and probably this is some kind of a trigger for the motivation for art to be created within you. I think this is an unavoidable emotional trigger that happens on either side of the house. This is something that lies symmetric. However, the delta is the society does not value this on their side, on our side of the house. The society does not think and rely on the official interpretation of what the art means or what the messaging it was. You yourself have to find the meaning towards art, and that is the only way in which you can find the messaging of the art on the outside of the house. So on the outside house, there's going to be things like statues and movies existing, but there's not going to be official meaning. So no things like, oh, this is a religious statue and stuff like that perceived by society. But there are things like statues, but it's visually perceived as religious and thinking that this is a statue of my God, but maybe not for other people, and within the same religion, the other people might not think the same thing. Second thing I want to characterize, what is art? And I don't want to know here that very briefly, that art is not just limited things like painting as scripture, sculptures, but just things more in general, things like pop cultures as well, things like movies, things like books. I think all those things exist. And these things, and what I want to know here critically is that art oftentimes evokes emotion from it in many instances. When individuals see some kind of art, your emotions get moved. When you see a movie of someone of like a very great friendship, you might feel the nostalgia that you had within your youth, the sportsmanship that you found in the sporting documentary. We believe these are kind of things that you rely on, you gain emotional from the consumption of art, and we think this leads to oftentimes your own interpretation towards it, and therefore our characterization is something that is very, very reasonable. On opposition, however, it is perceived that art is something consuming, involves somewhat of a concept and messaging, and almost always. And oftentimes, I want to know here that art you'll find on their side of the house is oftentimes created by the majority and the powerful people who is just going to be very, very oppressive and majoritarian. Why is this true? Oftentimes, they are the people who is in positions like the directors and who can have simply the most lobbying power in order to direct these kind of messaging towards the society. But secondly, we believe these people also have the capacity to influence things like education and politics to decide the direction of the message that they want throughout their organization. And notice oftentimes they do also have the incentive to do so in order to maintain the current society that is simply benefiting them because of the privileged status they're currently holding. So it's going to be things like very majoritarian as well as going to be very, very oppressive. This looks like things like not giving minority a place to put their art in galleries and like that. Things like having a minority art symbol not being represented and to be shown to the public because the director cuts off the planning of it at the point in which it is discussed within the companies and stuff like that. That is the kind of world the opposition needs to defend. The argument we will propose from the government, the art is going to be accessible as well as individuals are going to be much more able to find meaning towards it before yet. Yes.
If it is true that people would still interpret art on the your side of the house, the authoritarian people who goes on the top would do it symmetrically on the your side because you can control people on either side of the house.
No, the difference is on our side of the house, you have to find the meaning towards art, and that is only going to be the accessible and the acceptable way of interpreting art. The government side, surely the government or the people in power may be able to say, I think this art is about this, but they cannot say this art is about this. There have to be a claim that I think this art is, and that is not going to be able to influence other people that easily than on our side of the house. Then, why is art much more accessible on the outside of the house? The first thing I want to know is that simply more art we believe is going to be created. Because the fact that there is not going to be any sort of public perception that requires any kind of concept and a strong messaging means that you're just more lowers the hurdle for you to create art, and there's no pre-existing bias to negate your piece of work. Even if you do not have a strong messaging that you want to deliver to the society, yes, you can create your art, and yes, you can publish it. This is the kind of incentive and the calculus the individual likely to make right outside the house. There's just going to be more art created. And crucially, because there's not going to be the requirement of a concept as well as a messaging, we simply believe there's just going to be much more of diversification of the scale and the types of art that you'll be able to find on the outside. But secondly, more art is going to reach the eyes of the public. This is a thing that censoring and filtering is going to be impossible by the majoritarian people that you would find on their side. This is again because you will not be able to now find the justification towards it. You're not going to be able to say this is harmful to the society, so we will not publish it. That is going to be impossible because the art in its nature is not going to hold that kind of concept. You have to try to justify much more, and therefore think that minority art who tries to fight against the oppression stuff situation is not going to be able to be washed out on the outside of the house. But thirdly, I just want to note here that there's going to be much more availability for discussions to occur for the interpretation of the art. Because individuals are going to be relying on, it's going to be relying towards each individual to like note how they perceive the art. They can say, I think this art is about X. Other people can say, I think this art is about Y. In these instances, there's necessarily going to be discussion that is going to be rising for the much more acceptance towards interpretation, as well as discussion to various opinions that might rise within the society. Why is this argument important? First thing, minority. The art is now going to reach them. I think that is very crucial for simply having things like emotional relief and stuff like that. But furthermore, the fact that art is reaching the public itself is going to be a good that you're going to be able to feel as a minority artist. This can be simply things like money coming into your pocket, as well as your piece of work seen by the public being itself a good for your self-esteem and like that. But secondly, for the vast majority of people, I'm going to use the word that KPS really loves. You're going to be able to feel catharsis. The fact that you're going to be able to find the art that's going to be much more matching your own preferences, because there's much more diversification, more art, we're able to feel better meaning within this each piece of work. I'm very proud of us.
Okay, thank you for your speech. And next, I will welcome the leader of opposition, Yuichiro.
All right. Okay, then before moving on to my speech, I guess I'll do a quick shout out to my beloved KDS members. Thank you so much for bringing me here. I'm so proud to be, and I'm so grateful to be right here in spring tournament, which is big May. I love you so much. You guys are my precious nakama. I love you guys. Okay, then for POIs, please stand up before vocalizing, and if I don't notice your POI, please vocalize. Then for my gender pronouns, please call me she or her. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We denied the definition from governments that this is only about the interpretation of art. We believe that both sides talk about this concept. We believe that on both sides, the concept or purpose is not shown or told by in government side. The concept or purpose is not shown but told by the artist, because the interpretation is what makes art interesting. Therefore, this is about whether or not art should have a concept or purpose. And we defend a world in which artists make out with purpose and concept. That's why we're happy to vote this motion. Before moving on to my main arguments, I would like to set up two things. Firstly, about the art. I think art contains any creative methods, for example, picture or music or novel, etc., etc. Secondly, a non-counterfactual is kind of close to status quo, but people have both beauty. People can have both enjoy the beauty and meaning of the art. So those who view art can be picked. Those who view art can pick and choose whether they like to interpret art as beauty or whether they like to interpret art as a meaning of some symbol. For example, if you listen to student song, even when you don't in love, even when you don't have girlfriend, right? But you can also listen to student song when you actually have student in your life, which means that you can enjoy both beauty and the meaning of the artistic measures. Moving on to my speech, I'll talk about one thing. Why is the significance of art really important? And I'll have 3 points, which is first, accessibility. I think its theme would be difficult to understand in government side of the house. Because in government side of the house, there will be no art, but only textbook to explain complex kind of concepts like word or minority measures, right? These things are not something that can be expressed within the word, and people, especially people on the ground who is not that academically skilled, have to have this kind of sometimes methods to perceive what suffering they have or what kind of consequences they bought by visually attractive measures, right? That's because that would be more interesting for them to be interested in that field. That would lower the hurdle for them to actually think about that kind of problem. In opposition side, we can use art to understand the heart of the word. Plus, with the existence of textbook. For example, if you look at Mungu, I think that art is about the bombing. I think it's easier for you to understand how devastating the effect of the war was compared to you looking at the textbook saying that there are 5 million dead due to this war. It's kind of absurd. But if you think about Mungu and if you think about other artistic figures about war, I think it's more easy for you to understand how hurtful that was, right? And B, I think enjoying the beauty of art or beauty of the art in itself is quite hard. I think you need to have this academical knowledge. For example, if you want to interpret the beauty of the Last Supper, you need to know this kind of concept of vanishing point. This is an artistic word. I think be academical skill. From a point of view of creators, you have to be academically skilled to draw a picture so beautiful, right? For example, the picture of moon isn't that beautiful, but academically, color mixture and brightness of the brushwork would be necessary for you to truly know the beauty of the earth. So in the common side of the house, art would be elite for elite, and these themes would be for elite who can understand textbook, who can interpret art with the academical knowledge that they have. So the creators who can only success if only they have academic skill, or because that kind of things can only be subsidized by the audiences. But in our side of the house, opposition can have both beauty of the art and the plus meaning of art. So you can academically analyze art if you want, and you can also use art to understand complex things like conflict or about the minority, which is incapable of doing that. If you are living in government counterfactual, people are more likely to access to these kind of complex spots in our side of the house. Then moving on to individual catalysis. Okay, in a government side of the house, only elites who understand would be able to talk about these kind of things. But I think we have this avenue to talk about these issues because art is easy to understand. Therefore art is kind of easy to spread, right? Art becomes a tool to share same topic around people, and I think this becomes the tipping point for people to start interested in that kind of topic and start to have this kind of avenue to talk about these kind of issues that never happened in the opposition side, government side, because government side only provides these spaces for elites who understand textbook. I'll rely.
If I watch some kind of a painting and feel some kind of nostalgia, despite of knowing what the context it was made of, this is an emotional response that I had internally within myself. How is that not happening on the outside of the house still?
Having nostalgia in itself does mean something. Like if you have nostalgia, then that's it, right? But if you can't find meaning in it, there is something that you can learn. There's something that goes into change in our side of the house. If you feel nostalgia, that's the only moment you will feel. The second later, you would forget about that. In our side of the house, we have this theme, so you are going to know that there is a theme behind this. There is a message behind this. You're going to try to interpret why you feel nostalgic towards that art because you know that there's a theme of the art on outside the house, right? So you can basically have this kind of tipping point to talk about. People can have this kind of tipping point to talk about the issues that are never discussed in only discussed by elites and government side of the house. And I think you would feel that you are allowed to talk about these issues because art is also the symbol of freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And if art is expressing some topics of minority topics, then you would feel that, oh, I can also talk about minority issues because art is something that also signifies freedom of right and freedom to express something, right? So in our side of the house, this kind of art would provide you the feeling that you're allowed to talk about this issue. You're allowed to talk about the information in textbooks that says 5 million people dead because you have art, we have the same topic, we have the same picture for people to share to understand how devastating the war was, right? And I think from incentive of self-expression, in the first place, creating art without any message is kind of impossible, right? Like lyrics, how do you write lyrics if you don't have any message to it? Like it's hard to write create artistic thing without any messages behind you. And if people don't really talk about your art, they just pass through your art because there's no meaning to it, they just enjoy it, then why do you want to create art in the first place, right? And I think in our side of house representation also increases. Note that there's an example of Black Lives Matters using a lot of many pictures and drawing, right? I think this is why minorities art is represented as art for minority. In common side, art where minority appears would be interpreted. In opposition side, we would interpret art as art where minority struggles but try to survive with hope and will. I think you're more likely to feel that you're finally represented in your identity and don't have it in common side house. Practical first.
Okay, thank you for your speech. And we will invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you.
Ready for it?
Yeah, okay.
Opposition's Orwellian version of art, how we think and what we feel. Art is majoritarian, art is oppressive, and art is exclusive. We want to free the meaning of art and democratize it and bring benefit to majority, 5% minority. I want to first be really clear on the characterization of what our world looks like with the concept of the autonomy of art. Because I want to be really clear. Our side still has people and it still has individuals who perceive and internalizes art to begin with. So art is existing on our side and it presumably exists under this concept of the autonomy of art. What does this mean? Firstly, as they say, it is incredibly difficult to create art without having a purpose to begin with. Obviously, you would have a purpose and then still make art on our side of the house. But secondly, and more importantly, the difference is how individuals perceive and interpret this art. Obviously, there's not going to be an objective meaning, so there's no such thing as, oh, this subjective meaning of this one specific art is this. For example, things like loving and passion. The difference is that one person may do things like messaging, but it's far less persuasive because the role of the interpretation is now delegated upon every single individual, and every single individual have multiple different interpretations of that art, which is more subjective. Which is why I think there are things like discussion still happens in art and health. It's more of things like opinions that you have, how you think this art is meaningful. First question, let's talk about accessibility. Their first claim is that themes will be difficult because this is things like text. Serious responses. Firstly, again, we still have art on our side of the house as well. But secondly, I don't think text is that difficult. And in fact, most people do want their messaging to be told, do want things like, the text to be understandable in the eyes of others. And therefore, I think there is a way where you can make text understandable, even if you're uneducated. But thirdly, I think the text is in fact better because it carries the subtle nuances that art or things like paintings are unable to tell. So in fact, we look at analysis if that's that. But the second thing I want to point out is our analysis that was just not responded to. We tell you from first that more art numerically is created in our side of the house. For example, in things like movies, there's more things like spin-offs, there are more things like fan art, there's more things like discussions, and there's no things such as things like canon. So individuals can really interpret art and art side of the house, which is important because insofar they say meaning and things like that is important, we are the one that best maximizes meaning for those individuals who need the most. Secondly, let's talk about the conservative context. Our claim was simple. Our claim was that these art oftentimes is used in an oppressive manner by people in positions of power. This looks like the statues of war heroes in India to oppress those victims, or this looks like the Nazi symbols in Germany in the 1940s, or this also looks like the religious scriptures, which is oftentimes created on the notion of internal exclusivity and demonizing others. These are the types of art that uniquely exist in their world, that uniquely carries out the persuasion where individual normalizes these types of ideas. Why is the conservative context important? Because opposition will tell you in this debate the conservative context is a minority of example and it doesn't matter. No, because these contexts carries the most vulnerable individuals that we must care about. These are the individuals who are literally enslaved or receive the worst forms of messaging and are being discriminated in the status quo. We cannot just be dismissive of their insight. What then is the comparative? Because the opposition explains how, oppressive people will symmetrically oppose oppressed people on both sides of the house. But this is obviously not true, because the difference is, number one, oppressive individuals do understand, and even if they do, I think the fact that, those types of art are not going to carry the same level of persuasion anymore. Because even if oppressive individuals resort to things like art and tells you that those people are rats and they don't matter, these things are just one opinion that is just, just delegated by one single individual, as opposed to something that is just, put on a pedestal on side opposition, because that is something that is told by the state. The difference is that on our side, there are multiple ways in which we can resist this one single messaging and say that, there's things like reputations that you can provide towards these art, insofar as there is no such thing as objectification. And I think both sides of the house agree that this one single concept that we are debating whether this is good or bad is something that is internalized within people's minds on either side of the house. We think that in our world uniquely, individuals have the capacity to fight back against what the oppressive individuals, leaders for the state, have failed to do. Why is art uniquely oppressive and important? And this is because art does, just tell things in your senses. It's to your eyes, it's to your ears, it's to how you feel. It uniquely moves individuals away, which is why I think, the alternative methods by which individuals try to oppress individuals are something that is, less persuasive in this debate. Before I move on to political change, how to feel on. Let's talk about change, because opposition in this debate will definitely talk to you about how art is important for political change to create protection for the minorities. The first thing I want to point out is just with this analysis. States use this art, people in positions of power use this art to oppress individuals. This looks like in education, where visual and paintings are used to inculcate students from a young age and tell them that, for example, like homosexuality is a thing, or the fact that some people will are converted in hell, for instance, or the fact that in movies there are oppressive messaging towards gay individuals, for example. Those are the types of ways in which oppressive individuals use them. Why then is this characterization more likely than the ways in which you create change from the eyes of minorities? The structural reason for this is
People in positions of power have more capital, have more connection, have more agenda setting power, and hence, even if in some cases, let's say for example, I don't know, some sort of minority art is able to create change, I think just in terms of the probability, our case is more likely, the oppression is far more likely. Secondly, minority art is far more likely to be accepted on our side of the house. Note, accessibility is the prerequisite for their benefit. Because even if they say minority art may be able to create change, it is predicated upon minorities being able to actually create art in the very first place. Our claim is that when art is subjective, we become much more accepting of other individuals' art. Other people can create art even if that they have a contradictory idea towards the majority's views, insofar as we believe and know for a fact that art is subjective, know for a fact that other people also have different opinions, and know for a fact that minorities do matter as well, which is why minority art, if they want to talk about it, is far more likely to exist on our side of the house, which is why there's things like normalization, which is why there's things like internalizing this idea that minority does matter in the debate. Thirdly, political change is just not important in this debate insofar as it happens in different ways as well. There's things like discussions in parliament about things like the importance of Indigenous rights in Australia, for example. These things didn't happen through art, it happened through generations of discussions that happened over time. For all of those reasons, we win with oppression to conservative individuals, the most vulnerable.
Okay, thank you for your speech, and we will invite the deputy leader of opposition. Here.
This question is about whether art should be independent of the concept of purpose. I think this encompasses many things. First of all is in terms of the making of the art, whether or not you are able to put in a message, or whether you can talk about your politics or religion or culture within your artistic expression. I think they also have to deal with that. But another place it encompasses is in terms of interpretation. So even if there is a message hidden on both sides, I think it's whether or not the audiences look for a specific concept or purpose and not just feel like nostalgia, but go further into like what this like artist is trying to convey, etc. We think that the amount of like the messaging that is going to reach the audiences is probably just likely to be larger on our side. Then going to my main points. First of all, I'm going to talk about like oppressive art and like minority art, because they tried to weigh that oppressive art is probably likely to be more prevalent. Let me explain is the important part is why does this oppression have to be in the form of art? They can do it in terms of like direct discrimination, or through like through speeches, or like through stripping away the rights of these individuals. If they have incentive to do this, we think that they're going to do it anyway without this art. But we explain the uniqueness of like minorities being able to express themselves through art. First of all, we explain how art is uniquely easy to understand. You can simply like especially when it's made with a specific concept or purpose, we think that it's more likely to be made in a form that is like more palatable, more easy to understand for more audiences. And therefore we think that that is the type of art that is likely to be more prevalent. Next issue I'm going to talk about is why this is better for artists in terms of the accessibility point about the success of the art, which leads to kind of like the revenue or like the consumer base, why this is more likely on our side. First of all, note that these artists on our side uniquely have a competitive advantage because such purposes usually are tied to like the background or unique life experiences that these artists have. For example, Black artists would likely have an advantage in like paintings that experience their culture, for example, and therefore we think that that gives a unique like vantage way for them to compete against like other white or more like privileged artists. On their side, like they have to compete merely on kind of the techniques or the aesthetics of the art. We think that having purpose be something that is important, that is deemed as something
that is important, allows these people to actually gain a competitive advantage. But second of all, we think that this on our side is rather likely to reach a wider audience. This is because there's multiple aspects to the art. It's probably not just the concept or purpose on our side. We think we also have the aesthetic part. For example, the composition or the type of colors that is used, the type of brush that you use. If it's music, it's probably the melody or the tempo, etc. They say that we still feel nostalgia from there, but we think that the amount of people that feel different things or that are able to perceive different things is much more on our side when you add this unique kind of perspective or concept that is only existed on our side. They talk about how there's less audience because you are there's censorship and by the authoritarian regime. I think that these regimes can find a justification anyway, that this is made by a minority group and they're trying to go against this regime by this art. If art on their side is not created with a specific purpose or concept, we think that anyway that authoritarian regime is able to manipulate the messaging even on their side. And therefore, we think that comparatively ours is likely to reach a wider audience in the more broad context on our side. But third of all, as we have explained, art is likely to be reserved or gated for the privilege on the government side, because often the value of the art, without the concept of purpose, is likely to be more complex, artistic techniques, etc. When that is the only thing you have to kind of evaluate the value of art. In such things, you need academic knowledge, you need that degree in art in order to be able to do that. But rather on our side, we think that we have more art that is easier to understand insofar as it is made with the purpose of giving out a certain message or a certain concept. We think that that is the point of the art, and therefore it's more likely to be able to be made by more amount of people and not and be seen as a good art by more people. Next, I'm going to do kind of the weighing in terms of why even if they have more accessibility of art, even if their art reaches more people, why kind of the representation or why the fact that you're able to actually put in a message and that message is being seen by people is something that is important. The intuition pump here is maybe you make art that is seen by many people, but what's the point of it if it has no purpose, if it has no message? You make art that is palatable enough to escape that authoritarian regime on their side, but you end up with a random or a random flower, for example. You're not able to put your emotions, what you want to say or what you want people to know about your experiences, and also the fact that the audiences aren't looking specifically into the purpose or specifically into what you want to say in order for that art to be there, and therefore we think that there's no point in making such art, or there's no benefit in making such art if that's the point. Sure.
Sure, some people might directly discriminate individuals in our world, but difference is on scale. Significantly less people are persuaded by hateful rhetoric.
Okay, sure. I'll deal with that. But the structural way that I have is, first of all, we think that representation or being able to put your message into art is something that is logically prior. It's the reason that you want accessibility or you want people to see art in the first place. But second of all, the ability to feel catharsis is higher. You're likely to hear the voices or discussions about the issue that you wanted to be talked about in your art. That for example, if it's the oppression or if it's your suffering, you're likely to hear from the people that might have similar experiences to you. We think that those are the voices that are likely to matter to you most, much more than this reaching a vast, wider amount of audience. And therefore, we think that that is something that is uniquely achieved on our side. Finally, in terms of why this is just better for people in general, first of all, we think that there is much more likely to be more amount of art, because talking about a specific purpose or specific message is something that is accessible. Anyone has specific experiences that they want to talk about, and on their side, we think that it's difficult to kind of convey a specific artistic technique. We think that that is much more gatekeep. If it's more amount of art, more possibility that you can feel something from it, we think that that's also beneficial and therefore proud to.
Okay, thank you for your speech, and we will invite Government Whip. Thank you.
I'm first going to deal with the sole claim about discourse and then moving on to two ways. Firstly, the claim about discourse. Natsuki already mitigated this that much, like discourse and social change doesn't happen only through art, but we have just simple discussions and a lot of people having discussions not on the sphere of art, but any other fields. But we will told you about it in specific characterization from PM LO about the textbook. Art in textbook. I would argue and protest against this we can still use the photos of historical context, right? I think what we're gonna prove is that photo is more better than messengers in terms of historical messages than art, because art is very artificial. You can create some you can put a lot of meaning and messages into art, and that's what the opposition is trying to say. But art is very artificial and subject to any manipulation of the state, right? Photo is very realistic. You cannot change the fact, right? So I think in terms of minority oppression, you can just put the photos and videos onto textbook or any online social media that black people was oppressing people taking the streets and historical and you can make people understand the historical context better and more accurately by photos, right? So I think photo is better, and I think still accessible outside the house. Nextly, moving on to two-way. The first is censorship. We will tell you that censorship is very, very unique argument, and we can take advantage of this edge. Why this is very unique to outside the house? Two reasons. Firstly, government cannot on our side of house, government and especially authoritarian regime do not fear any anti-regime interpretations of the art, right? Because the different people have different interests on our side of the house. The reason why many authoritarian regimes preemptively do not showcase their anti-oppressive, anti-regime art on the museum is that they fear potential interpretation of art, right? But on our side of the house, people have different interests. They have reduced fear. Government have a reduced fear of people interpreting in a way that government would expect. The second thing is that we couldn't limit this argument into authoritarian state, right? We also talk about religious institutions banning anti-religious art, or religious institutions publicly denounce the art from the other sects, like Sunni art from Sunni, publicly just discriminating the art from Shia or something like that. Or conservative people in developed nations would try to ban or boycott the buying and try to do not visit a museum which showcase the art, progressive art. Okay? I think that people don't buy art or government don't buy banning art on their side of the house, but those people wouldn't try to do so because just because they are just simply because these art is created by minority. What is happening in the status quo is that people have this solid and objective and subtle interpretation of art, and that's why a lot of people try not to buy art or try to ban art just because they are from minorities, right? Even if this is artist is just created or just pure intent curiosity, or this is not intended to if the creator is not intending to create the art in order to advocate something anti-regime messages, I think anti-government is very kind of very too careful and too cautious about these messages and try to ban it preemptively, right? But this won't happen on our side of the house because just because they are minority. I think this analysis is very crucial because this relate and this addresses their demands for restrictive interpretation of this motion, right? They need to say that we should defend also we should also defend the world where creators do not have any intentions in art when they create art. I think right now the potential artists from minority background is likely to be deprioritized just because they're minority, just because they induce hatred among majority. I think those cases would likely to happen on our side of the house. Minority will likely to have more platform to express themselves. Because their art and what they have created is not going to be categorized as art from minorities, right? So why this is very important? What we are saying is that having more opportunity, giving more opportunity for minority artists is better than social change. The reason why this is very superior is twofold. Firstly, I think this is proximate impact, right? Just selling more means that it is more direct than just sell your art and make people see this art and make people think something, and they make them to change and take actions. They have to take a lot of logical steps to make social changes in order to generate discourse on the outside of the house. But we have proximate and certain impacts inside the house. But secondly, let's look at the incentive of minority artists. Right? I think minority artists is not down. I think they won't just naively think one art create a lot of bigger changes in the future. I think what they can do at best is just their contributions to social changes is at best very small, right? So I think it is super naive to say one art create social changes and organizations. But on us, so I think the certainty of impacts to happen is very, very low on the outside of the house. Second thing I want to point out is that harmful art and harmful interpretation of art is likely to decrease on outside the house, right? The reason for this is that I want to verb here is that even if on outside the house there's slandering, bad mouthing, and criticism towards minority exists, but art is a very specific form to negatively affect others and affect others. The reason for this is art is very universal and beyond language. Okay? So specific language can communicate with specific individuals. You cannot badmouth towards saying there are certain ethnicities, but art beyond nationalities and boundaries, and many people negatively influenced by some art and statues of the victories. For those reasons, I think a lot of people will negatively impress and influence on the aspect of us. That is very bad. I am so proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for your speech, and we will invite the opposition wing. Please here.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you to my partners. You guys are the best partner. 皆さん、ありがとうございます。店員さん、忙しいのでありがとうございます。ここにいる人たち、ありがとうございます。
Just to clarify one thing, we can see the fact that there are messages in the art in either side of the house. The delta we propose is how people react after they receive the art in the first place. General people would not have the incentive to try to look for the messages that is hidden in the art uniquely on the side proposition. This is problematic because now even if you draw art that contains messages, there's going to be less people who are willing to buy into the messages or who are willing to interpret the messages on their side proposition. This is a unique delta that opera is able to create with this way. Look at the examples of Banksy. Banksy draws art which contains a lot of messages in status quo, and people try to understand what Banksy is advocating for. This is not likely to happen on proposition because people now believe that Banksy is just writing a random art on the downside of the house, and simply there's going to be less people who are willing to buy into this art and styles of the art. That leads to two impacts that negate the proposition impact. First, it lessens the message. It lessens the art that contains messages on their side proposition uniquely, because there's going to be less people or less artists who believe that their messages are going to be part of the society under proposition. Because now there's going to be less people who would buy in or read the messages, and therefore the artists will simply have less incentive to draw art, which is not likely to be listened or heard by the society. That decreases the net amount of art uniquely under the side proposition. But the second thing is, you cannot actually anticipate people to interpret in the best manner the proposition wants to claim, because no people would actually interpret the art in the first place. Then, who is going to manipulate and weaponize this art? It's going to be the person who they do not want them to interpret. For example, the people in power, the people in authoritarian regime, the people in this religious organization are now going to tap into this market and uniquely weaponize this art on side proposition. Because one, there is no absolute answer on the side proposition, which means that you can still interpret you can still teach how to interpret this art on the side proposition still. For example, the leader in authoritarian regime telling that this art should be interpreted in this way, or this interpretation is the most persuasive way to interpret.
This is still likely to happen on proposition because you can still teach the ways in which you can interpret the art on the side of proposition. But the fact is, nobody would actually doubt on that interpretation because it's just the fact that this leader thought that this way. But under opposition, now you simply have a counterbalance narrative to not believe or buy into this narrative because you feel that there is a correct answer behind this art. You feel that you have to find the correct art and not be fooled by these people who try to weaponize this narrative under opposition. This is a unique moment when people can interpret this art in a different way than this authoritarian regime or the leaders of this organization imposes them to interpret in the first place. This nicely leads to how conservative art's interpretation of regard are worse in government. First, the people who actively try to interpret art is going to be those who have malicious intention to weaponize art under the side of proposition. And these people are now more likely to be blindly affected by these people. Because one, no people would discuss the actual meaning of the art because now people believe that it's okay for individuals to interpret this art in an individualistic way. This makes it possible for these leaders to manipulate the narrative or manipulate the ways in which you guys interpret the art on the side of proposition. Which means, for example, the leaders can say that I interpret this art in this way and this is the correct because this is my regime, this is my organization, and you guys believe deeply into me. For example, the deep believers are going to believe that the ways in which this person interprets is true, rather not thinking about what the actual author or the actual creator of the art thought about or thought what this message should contain on. This is a reason why first, there's simply going to be less critiques towards the art interpretation for the leaders too, because there is going to be less counterbalance narrative to assess whether the art's actual interpretation is correct or not. That is the reason why it's far worse on the side proposition. But the second is, rather on outside of the house, people have unique incentive to interpret the art in a favorable manner or inspect whether their ways or the leader's inspection towards the art is correct or not. On the outside of the house, there's going to be more individuals who try to seek for the accurate answer or try to seek for the accurate or the actual interpretation of the art much likely in opposition. Which means, even if you cannot believe that this is the correct answer, people can now uniquely think about what this art actually interprets on the outside of the house. This largely mitigates proposition's impact because it's not necessarily true that on outside of the house, people cannot have any sort of other interpretation. Even on outside, people can still have their concept of art. People can still believe what this art actually means. Under proposition, what they believe that on outside, you simply go straight into this one correct answer. Like, this is not true, right? Obviously, even on outside of the house, people can believe what is true. People can believe what concept that this art is actually meant to do. This is symmetric, but what rather worse on proposition because of the simple fact that people now have less incentive to inspect on what this art means uniquely outside of proposition because they don't think that there's a message behind it, and the leaders teach them how to interpret this. That leads to much more manipulation of this narrative of conservative art, which actually harms the people on the ground and flips the case in proposition. Yes.
When there is the concept of the autonomy of art, here's a concept of subjectivity, means that there is multiple discussions of differing incentives, and therefore you would likely think to yourself what the best interpretation of this art is.
Yeah, that's symmetric going to happen on outside the house as well, because notice that the one pursuing for one correct answer is actually symmetrical. We want to discuss whether which concept or which interpretation is true, right? That is not comparative. Then the discussion thing. This is much likely to happen on outside the house because notice why a discussion occurs in the first place. It's because you have to find a correct interpretation of the art. If all people believe that different interpretation is okay, nobody would vocalize their interpretation, or nobody wants to discuss whether this actually the interpretation is actually true or not. The unique moment when this discussion occurs when there is a correct answer towards that message or a correct answer of interpretation. Because notice, in academia, the reasons why people discuss what is true is because there's a definite answer to it. The reasons why that's not likely to happen on proposition is that they say that it's okay for people to have different opinions. Why then the discussion is likely to happen is very unclear to me. Under opposition, we take that uniquely. Because there isn't one definite answer, people are now going to discuss on what is correct and what is wrong uniquely under opposition, which creates a much larger scale discussion under our side of the house, which largely flips the proposition case. Because notice on our side of the house, we simply have much more people who buy into this discussion to find this correct answer comparatively to proposition. Because now prop on prop, you think that your interpretation is true, and you do not have an incentive to actually discuss whether your interpretation is true or not, because nobody would believe in that, right? People would just think that it's random, your opinion, nobody would listen to that. On the other side, there's simply much more incentive for people to discuss about this action, and therefore we simply have a discussion, which I think proposition wanted to also protect. effect. But last of all, notice that we already flipped the material on how there is one type of weaponization of this narrative. We explained to you that on the outside of the house, it's uniquely that on the outside we simply have much more room for interpretation, and there is less chances of these dominators or these people in power to actually manipulate these ways in which you can interpret it on the outside of the house. This is unique to outside, more than happy to oppose.
Okay, thank you for your speech. And we will invite the last speaker from opposition. Opposition reply. Here.
Shout out to my teammates. Thank you for teaming up with me. I'm too old to be in this competition, but it's my effort. Yeah, thank you to everyone for the debate. The issue I want to deal with is their case on censorship or accountability, that they say that authoritarian regimes can utilize this art to boycott their art, or their religion institution like denouncing anti-religious art. And they say if there's diverse interpretation on their side, you won't be censored. Several issues here. First of all, we explained that they have incentive and capacity to ban this because minorities are probably already like oppressed there. There's not large delta that they do. But second of all, if you wanted to be anti-religious, if you wanted that message to be there and making an alternative art that doesn't have that message but is widely spread, just there is like no benefit that you get from that, and therefore we don't think that they actually prove kind of a positive case. And then they shift to say that it's good that they can sell their art and there's like less censorship, you can gain like more money, etc. But the question is like, can they actually sell their art? We don't think that they recognize this. When we explain there's a lot of competition, people in majority probably likely to have an advantage over you that is an oppressed minority. But another question is, why do they need to have this profit from the art? They could probably find a different job, etc. I think that there's just a lot of gaps in their mechanization to feel that there's a benefit to this like minority in these massively oppressive regimes. And therefore, at best, the benefit they gain is very, very small in their marginal context that they explain. What we explain is the broader context in the general rule. It's probably good for the people to not have this autonomy of art in two ways. First issue is about how broad you can spread your art. First of all, we explain how there's more aspects to see from the art. There's increased chance for people to empathize with it and be interested when you don't just see a sunflower, but you want to know what like hides behind that, for example. We think that there's just more chance that people are interested in that. But second of all is that we explain how poor or disadvantaged rather have an advantage when there is no autonomy of art, because that purpose or like background is something that gives these artists the uniqueness or like the value in and of itself, and they can make their art like more interesting or outstanding other than the like vast majority of art that exists. And therefore, if we want to talk about kind of like how they can access like more people look at their art, they gain money like from being able to sell their art. We think that that is also much more on our side. But the main issue we talk about is in terms of catharsis or like representation. And we don't go like overboard to say that you can kind of massively change people's view if you were to be a oppressed minority, but it goes to the extent to say that like you can show people like what your experience is like. There's more people that sympathize with you, which means that gradually there might be like some changes in your status if you were to be oppressed. That like the message that you're trying to convey through things like protests or through other like means is probably likely to get through because you have this art in the first place. So on our side, since you can have the concept and purpose, there's also the increased chance that people notice or discuss about the possible purpose because that's what they expect from the art. You think that what you wanted to show from your background is probably going to be there. So you can show like how you feel or how your experiences are. Then the way in terms of like why this representation matters more than the accessibility. I already explained like how the purpose of making that art in the first place, like for these individuals, is to give like a certain message, and therefore like if it doesn't have a message, there's no kind of meaning for it to like spread in the first place. They don't explain the benefit from there. But second point of weighing is in terms of revealed interest. Like if they wanted to gain like more money or gain like more recognition, etc. We think that there's a lot of other things you can do other than art. The fact that they decided to do art that is something that isn't like guaranteeing you getting a lot of amount of money means that they want to like express themselves. They want to put in a specific like message into your art, and therefore we think that catharsis or representation that happens on our side is an issue that is more important, and therefore probably.
Great, thank you for your speech. Then we will invite the last speaker of the round, Gavin reply. Get here.
Before I forgot to do special thanks stuff, I want to give special thanks to my teammates, to my Haruto senpai. Thank you so much for inviting me to this tournament before I even get to have this entrance, you guys here, I'm going to say that. Also thank you to Sano senpai who taught me debating in my first year in autonomy debate, who was in the very first practice. Thank you so much. I was Junie. I was not allowed to be in the practice, but he gave me special permission to practice. Thank you so much. I owe you so much. You made me where I am today. Opposition builds monuments that assert that nationalism, that Hindus are the first classism that dominates other ethnicities. They enshrine statues that compels individuals to believe that Kosovo is a part of Serbia, that they tolerate movies and discriminate the queer. Take a look at the worst harms of opposition that they have proved to you in this debate. The opposition's worst harms is things like, text being too difficult, or the fact that you cannot have the representation, unclearly why that has to be achieved through means of art. Our claim was much more unique and had a scale of impact that was unresponded to. The first thing I want to do is explain why we swiftly win the compression and explain why all of their responses just doesn't work in this debate. The first response they provided was simply to say people can directly discriminate individuals without art, and that is not exclusive. The simple response to this is, as they say, many justifications may exist, but our crucial analysis was not responded to, that this receives far less buy-in from individuals on type of competition. I.e., art is uniquely compelling. Art just simply tells you through senses, through your eyes, through your ears. It is something that transcends a lot of things like language barriers. It is something that is uniquely compelling, and hence, even if there are some individuals who provide things like racist comments, the difference is the scale. And individuals who turn racist on our side of the house is significantly smaller in number in comparison to their side. And things like racist comments that come in through things like art is far more damaging to the minorities on their side of the house. Insofar as they internalize the idea that these are the types of comments that individuals in society believe, which is why I think they just simply suffer more on their side. The second thing what I look at is the opposition's whip's 2-minute analysis and how viewer will try to find the accurate answer for interpretation. Number one, this is ultimately contingent on the assumption that people is not persuaded yet. Because obviously, if people think that this is the accurate answer, then you obviously wouldn't question what the people in positions of power is saying. And we know for a fact in real life that the opposite is true. People obviously internalize the version of the answer their people in positions of power and the state tells them is. Like, for example, the fact that, homosexuality is a sin is oftentimes something that is posed to you as an answer by religious leaders, which oftentimes a lot of the followers do buy into, which is why I think their claim is wrong. The third thing they say is that people in positions of power will manipulate the interpretation of art. Obviously, the opposite is true, because people are less likely to be manipulated in our world when the art is seen as subjective, when art is seen as something where there is a room for interpretation on your own, where there's no objective answer, something that others tell you is an opinion of others, and that you have, basically you are the best decision-making body in terms of, having your own interpretation. Hence, on our side, you uniquely have more discussion, you uniquely have more opinions, and you become more tolerant and accepting of other people's opinions. Opposition never proved why people in positions of power on our side somehow supersedes this narrative. Because obviously, people are in positions of power, are still bound by this narrative, and therefore, even if they say things like, messaging, that's not going to be the objective answer in this debate on our side of the house. Finally, let's talk about representation, because the leader of the opposition reply wants to weigh this about other impacts of this debate. I would argue that accessibility is prerequisite for representation. Obviously, if the Black individuals are unable to create art, then these individuals are not likely to be, get the representation. And our claim was simple. On our side, insofar as more people will be accepting of different opinions, individuals are able to join, participate in art, even if you are a minority. Opposition says, if you are Black, then you have a comparative edge. That's just factually untrue. Obviously, Black individuals and people of color are discriminated in status quo, and we think that on our side, we uniquely expand the arts to the most vulnerable individuals insofar as the art is seen as autonomous and free from political needs. For all those reasons proposed.